Hey, New Testament survey. Let's look at Hebrews today, and I won't keep you too long. But this document is kind of in some ways a mystery. It's a really power-packed and filled book, but there's a lot of things we don't know about it. The author is a mystery. Some attribute it to Paul, some attribute it to others, but we don't know who wrote it. The intended audience is a bit of a mystery. I really don't know who it's to. I mean, the name itself, Hebrews, is anachronistic. That was used for the Israelites mainly in Egypt. I mean, I mean, the term even Israelite is kind of not well descriptive of the people who followed the Abrahamic faith after the Babylonian exile. Those before are Judahites. Those that kind of lived around Jerusalem before the Babylonian exile. Pretty much Judah was the environs of Jerusalem. And after the Babylonian exile, Jews, a variation of Judeans, became their name. Yehud was the designation for that area. So even Israelite or Hebrews, it's anachronistic. It's from a different time, different place. The genre of Hebrews is a mystery. It's kind of like a letter. It's kind of like a bunch of sermons. What is it? Its structure is even a mystery. And I've got two different outlines in different commentaries. The Hermeneia commentary by Harold Attridge has got one outline, and you kind of see some of the divisions there on the screen there. He breaks it up one way, and then we look at the another commentary here, if it'll pull up, and we find that there's the NIGTC, the New International Greek commentary there. It focuses on the Greek. There's a different outline there, different divisions. And I'll show you another outline here in a little bit that one of my professors from Divinity School came up with, or at least he borrowed from somebody he shared with us. I think it makes some sense. And his outline comes from, he published it in the Review and Expositor, which is a Baptist academic journal. But Hebrews is a mystery. It's really power-packed and loaded, but again, it's a mystery. Now, authorship. Unlike the Pauline epistles, there's no superscriptio mentioning the author. There's no note of who wrote it. Some church traditions suggest Paul, Barnabas, Luke, Clement of Rome. Some modern scholars have suggested Apollos, Silvanus or Silas, Philip the deacon, even Prisca or Priscilla, the wife of Aquila, Jude. We really don't know, but there's some things we can look at the text and kind of derive. And you'll notice my little notes here. I incorporated my notes in my program here. First, the writer was skilled in Greek, and that's evidenced by the superior vocabulary and syntax. There are 1,038 different words used in the book of Hebrews. 169 of those are only in Hebrews and nowhere else in the New Testament. So this person seems, or at least the writer seems to show a higher level of education, or at least a higher writing style. Okay. Concerning the syntax, author uses several long periodic sentences. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 is 72 words. 2 through 4 is 54 words. 12, 18 through 24 is 91 words. You can do that in Greek, and kind of in a way, the Sermon on the Mount is like a direct object of a sentence. 2 chapters of Matthew, in some ways, is very much serving as a direct object. But yeah, you could do that in Greek. English, it's that's called a run-on sentence. You write like that, I'm going to fail you, right? Anyway, the writer of Hebrews is skilled in alliteration and rhetoric. Author's fond of the P sound, the P alliteration. Alliteration's like, think of the phrase, she shall, I can't even say it right. She sells seashells by the seashore. The repetition of those sounds. Or some expository preachers like to use the alliteration, like use a certain letter, mnemonic and type devices and things like that. I mean, this writer is skilled in things like that. The letter P alliteration appears in 1:1 5 times, 11:28 5 times, 12:11 4 times, 2:2 3 times, 7:25 3 times, and 13:19 3 times. And again, this is in Greek, the p sound, the pi is one of the ways to get the p sound in English. Concerning rhetorical genre, some scholars believe that the author of Hebrews uses both epidictic and deliberative rhetoric. So this person seems to be very well educated, very well skilled. Now, as far as the audience goes, we don't know exactly who the intended audience was, but again, we can look at the text and we can flesh out some things that seem to be latent in the text. They seem to be second-generation Christians, and there seems to be some notion that they have been baptized. They have been initiated into the faith. The intended audience may have been Christians long enough to become teachers. 512 notes this, but their growth has been stunted. Their commitment, especially in their attendance at assemblies, has become lax. Don't forsake the gathering together of believers, has become the custom of some. But their waning commitment is evidence. And I've got several passages pulled up. 414 on the right side, this is the NRSV. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. Again, hold fast to that confession. Kind of like we find in the pastoral epistles, the notion of the faith versus faith. We find this kind of established orthodoxy, if you will, going on, our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, right? Some notion may be persecution or some notion of temptation, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So there's some sort of notion that they may be wanting to give up and they're needing to hold strong. Some other passages like this, and I get my computer to work here. Slow as molasses. 12:12, 12:13, 10:28-29. These passages also seem to convey this notion of there's some sort of pressure that wanes their commitment. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees, and make level paths before your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. So the weak knees. I love logos, but it does not work well on this surface. This is the lower end processor anyway, but oh well. But anyway, some members in the audience may have been imprisoned. Here's 10:28. Let me go ahead and just read 10:28. Anyone who rejected the law of Moses died without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much more severely do you think someone deserves to be punished who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, who has treated an unholy thing, the blood of the covenant, and sanctified them, who has insulted the Spirit of grace? It goes on, but yeah, some notions here of tempting to give up. There's notions of persecution. There's confiscation of property possibly going on, 1034. They have not shed blood yet, 12:3. But there seems to be some perceived persecution or hostility or torture. And I've got the references on the left side there, 1033, 12:3, 13:3. Public abuse and ridicule, which seems to be a reality in 1033. The verse here, sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. Other times you stood side by side with those who were treated so. You suffered long with those in prison, joyfully accepted confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So we can know a little bit about this audience. There seems to be some sort of persecution going on. There seems to be some sort of notion of wanting to give up on the faith. But as was Tertullian said later in Christianity, in early Christianity, said the blood of the martyrs are the seeds of the church, right? And we'll talk about martyrdom a lot more when we get to Revelation. But you'll notice on the left side of the screen there's an outline, and this is from my personal notes. This is kind of adapted from Dr. Robert Canoy's article in Review and Expositor, came out a few years ago. This is not a definitive outline that encapsulates all the material of Hebrews. This is a exposition or exhortation theme outline. Again, there's many ways, excuse me, the scholars have tried to figure out the structure of Hebrews. It's in some ways mysterious. But there are five times there's a passage usually emphasizes purity of Christ, acting as exposition upon either Old Testament quotations or allusions. and each expositional passage is followed by an exhortation section, getting the audience to do something to strengthen their commitment. And this is one of those, it's a really neat way to look at Hebrews. First exposition, the Son is divine and human, don't drift away. The Son is superior to Moses and Joshua. See, one of the things is in Hebrews, we find this contrast, we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, but there's this contrast between the Old Testament ways, the Old Testament figures, the New Testament figures, New Testament ways. This purity of Jesus, or even an earthly Adam, or an earthly temple and a heavenly temple. A very Platonic dualistic type notion that we find in Greco-Roman philosophy, and even in Jewish philosophers like Philo. Philo was alive around this time, roughly. You find this exposition going on here. You have the Son is the great high priest, going to maturity. The Son is a better priest, draw near. The faithful or righteous, etc. It's a really good, this is a really good, I think, outline, at least for those who are lay Christians, or even those teaching a Bible study, or even working ministers. I think it's a very functional way to approach Hebrews. Now, is it the only way to look at it? Does it pick up all the rhetoric? The scholars have noted, no, it doesn't, but again, it does function well. But this outline does remind us, these expositions, that the writer of Hebrews is very well versed in the Old Testament. There are several quotes and allusions to the Old Testament, especially the Septuagint. Hebrews 11, for example, is often called the Hall of Fame of Faith, mentions several major Old Testament figures. Melchizedek is a figure that's mentioned in Hebrews. He is briefly mentioned in Genesis 14:18 and Psalm 110:4. His name essentially is King of Righteousness, Melchizedek. Melchizedek is one of those figures who not only is mysterious. He doesn't come from anywhere, doesn't go anywhere. So that led to kind of a fascination with Melchizedek in Second Temple Judaism, which is early Christianity like this is Second Temple Judaism in some ways. In fact, the Dead Sea Scroll community fascinated about Melchizedek. Hebrews fascinates with this Melchizedek. He's mentioned 8 times in Hebrews and said Christ is the superior high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So again, this is the New Testament writings are a little different than Judaism of our day, but they're very much influenced by the Judaism of our day. And Melchizedek is one of those figures that's picked up upon. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 11, if I can get the dadgum thing to pull up. And we'll look at these Old Testament figures. Again, this is kind of a hall of faith of heroes of the faith we see in Hebrews chapter 11. We'll look at that. Let's see here. Faith is a reality we hope for. So this is a great exposition of faith we find in the text of the New Testament. And we got Enoch mentioned. We got Abel. Again, by faith, Abel offered up a better sacrifice than Cain. This is the Old Testament doesn't necessarily say, the Genesis story doesn't necessarily say why Cain slew Abel. But the writer of Hebrews fleshes it out. They give some exposition to it. They give some rationale for it. And that's what Judaism does. Judaism, even into the Rabbinic era, the time of the Talmud, the time of the Mishnah, the interpretation, they're always interpreting, trying to give some meaning to the text, just like a good Christian would today try to interpret the text. We find even commentaries in the Dead Sea Scroll community where they try to expound upon the text and try to make it applicable for their community. And that's what this is. This kind of midrash, this kind of interpretation, this hermeneutic is going on in Hebrews as well with these figures. Enoch is mentioned here. Enoch didn't see death. Enoch is another one of those figures from the Old Testament that's very much a fascination of Second Temple Judaism. There's apocalyptic books that focus on Enoch in Second Temple Judaism that bear his name, that weren't written by him. They're written, time around just before Jesus. but they're passed off as being his work. They're pseudo-epigraphic. They're false writings. They're meant to be in the spirit of Enoch, I guess you could say. Noah's mentioned here. Abraham. Um, Abraham's given a little bit of text here, especially this notion of faith. Isaac's mentioned, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. I always want to say Moses with the Yul Brynner Ten Commandments, Moses voice, right? A good bit about Moses there, kind of recounting the history. Rahab is mentioned, a female, by the way. And then we have the judges, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets. And all these are used as kind of a exposition. The faithful or righteous and obedient journeyers and tested, to give basis for the exhortation. In other words, this is what has been done. This is what we should do. Since these Old Testament figures have run this race, chapter 12, let's run the race. Let's also run the race. So this is very much a rhetorical type thing. So Hebrews is very much shaped by that. Now, going back to the issue of Greek philosophy, I did mention that Hebrews relies heavily on Platonic dualism. This idea of there's a perfect eternal realm of the spirit, and then there's an inferior changing world below. Platonic dualism is evident in the discussion of earthly priests and tabernacle, the heavenly high priest Jesus in a tabernacle, or the heavenly tabernacle, the distinction between the earthly altar where animals are sacrificed, and then the atonement for Christ's death is a heavenly type of atonement. And of course, there's other models for this, what the cross and Jesus did. And as I record this, we're in Holy Week in 2019, and so I'm thinking about the cross a lot. But if I can get my computer to work, I'll bring up Hebrews chapter 6. Hebrews 6:6 is one of those passages in the New Testament that troubles some people, especially those of the Southern Baptist tradition. There's kind of a notion in Southern Baptist life, at least those from Southern Baptist tradition, about it's kind of a playing of both Calvinism, Arminianism. We're once saved, but always saved. We can freely choose Jesus, but once we're saved, we're good. We can't do anything to get out of his hand. So again, it's kind of for those, especially like a Methodist context. Some of you have mentioned you're Methodist. This would have been a little foreign to Wesley and later Methodist theologians, because it's very much not Arminianist. It's more of a Calvinist type thing. But then again, Southern Baptists believe anybody can be saved. It's not just an elect. So that's how we kind of come from this bit of two worlds. And of course, there's some Baptists who are very Calvinistic. Some Baptists are very Arminianist slant, especially the free will type Baptist. So there's over 100 different type of Baptist denominations in the United States. So you got a bit of a type of Baptist for whatever you want to do. But this notion of falling away in Hebrews chapter 6 is very applicable to the community to whom the writer is writing, at least as best we can tell. Let's go on toward perfection, chapter 6, leaving behind the basic teaching about Christ, not laying again the foundation. So they're already Christians. There's already a foundation there: repentance from dead works, instruction about baptism, laying on of hands, resurrection. And it goes on to say, verse 6, and then have fallen away, since on their own they are crucifying again the Son of God and holding him up to contempt. So one of the issues that's going on here, and will go on in later Christianity, early Christianity, I should say, is this notion of what happens when people turn their back on God. Apostasy. That's a big fancy word there, apostasy. Can they come back to God? Were they ever, and what were they even ever in a relationship with God, or had a saving experience with God? Use kind of evangelical terminology there. But one thing to think of as far as early Christianity sees is that there was an issue for some early Christians. I'm thinking, second century especially, where they were offered an opportunity to, recant their Christianity, to give up Jesus and accept Caesar as Lord. And some Christians did it for fear of death, for fear of their lives, fear of losing their homes, their family. They would say Caesar is Lord and give up on Jesus, and at least verbally. before, when they're brought before government rulers or government leaders. Um, but what if they came back to the church? Could they be accepted back in since they publicly denied Jesus? Especially when Christianity became legal. What about those people that had recanted under prior rulers or whatever? Anyway, some of these issues came to the early church, and it was an issue in Hebrews as well. I mean, the writer is very much arguing for the people to hold fast and not to give up. And this is one of the rhetorical ways that the writer encourages to the audience not to give up. To mention this falling away, this notion of apostasy. So that's keep in mind. Now, I mentioned atonement. What does the cross of Jesus do? This is kind of some notes here that I had from when I was back in divinity school back in '05. From what is atonement? Jesus' cross, atonement is essentially at-one-ment in Jesus. We're made one with others and with God. Sacrifice, cognates such as sacred. In terms of sacrifice, the term sacrifice are two related terms, object and subject. You know, to what end does a sacrifice happen? There's two ways to look at this. There's expiation. The sacrifice offered to the subject is removal of guilt or sin of the person sacrificing. Propitiation, the sacrifice is given to appease the one whose holiness has been offended. And there's 5 types of sacrifice, Old Testament sacrifices. There's propitiatory, which is made to appease God, hold back his wrath. A lot of the ancient Near Eastern religions, and even Greco-Roman religions for that part, we find this type of appeasement of the gods going on. Gods and very much these other religions are very much kind of juvenile, don't make them angry, make them happy, don't take the kids' toys away from them type of thing. Another type of sacrifice, tributary, there's which is like tithes and tribute. Votive offerings that are made to accompany a vow. Thanksgiving sacrifices associated with votive offerings. There's free will offerings. All these different things. Old Testament practice of giving sacrifice. Person bring things, giving of oneself. But there's what exactly does the cross do? Several atonement theories. How are we atoned for? There's the educator, example, moral influence. The awesomeness of this ideal, the special man Jesus gives is the clearest picture of what God is like. Such an act in human history is so profound that it educates us in such an overwhelming way. Jesus is the ultimate moral example, ultimate educator of what we should be. He's the par excellence of the cross. Clement of Alexandria and Origen, two Greek-speaking church fathers, supported this. Abelard and Heloise, and also the Enlightenment of Bushnell and Schleiermacher, and dadgummit, computer went up too far. But another, not just the educator example of moral influence, we have another model, if this computer will work, is the satisfaction, ransom, or substitutionary or representation model. The justification model is prominent, very much so against Baptists, especially Southern Baptists. 2 Corinthians 5:15, if Jesus died for you, he's a substitute, or did he die on behalf? If he's a substitute, then you should have died. It comes down to behalf of or in place of 2 Corinthians 5:15. There's this model says that you die spiritually, but dying is transformed in a way that even if you didn't have a relationship with Jesus, your dying is different. Augustine very much bought into this model. Anselm parted ways with Augustine. But there's this notion we find, Calvin picked up this model, but he added the word penal, like penal substitutionary atonement. Jesus dying served in a substitutionary model. Calvin was legally trained. He applied it to the penal substitution model, leaning heavily on Paul's legal language. Anselm was attracted to the substitution model from the feudal system. Half price had to be paid. So anyway, to restore God's honor, it took Jesus' death to live up to the debt required. This strength is it takes sin seriously. It offers a logical rationale for the death of Jesus, but the weaknesses are it's too steeped in legal language, possibly imposing legal language on the text. And also the price that was paid, according to Anselm, was paid by the human side of Jesus. And this notion, this penal substitution, or this substitutionary model, can also lead to lawlessness. Jesus' death appeased the wrath of God. The transaction occurred, over and done with, so it doesn't matter what I do. It's one weakness of it. Universalism. Christ died for all, and we're all saved. Calvin counters this by saying that God must decide. Calvinism, the chosen, the select. This notion also, this model also splits the Trinity. It suggests that the Father is separate and distinct from the dying Son on the cross. But it is biblical. These views all have biblical support, biblical basis, and I think in some ways there's good things to them, but also drawbacks to them. There's different various ways to view the cross. It's not just one thing, but I think it's multifaceted. Now this one is the ransom Christus Victor redemption model. Christ won the victory over the devil. Notion of ransom by the precious blood of Christ in 1 Peter, Romans 3:21. This notion of the Greek slave model. And 35 to 45% of the Roman Empire were slaves. And I mentioned there's a few notes about slavery there. Irenaeus, the church father, championed this view. Some strengths are everything that threatens the world is addressed in this model. The victory is already accomplished. It points beyond the cross to final coming. Weaknesses, God as a deceiver is bad. It's not always pointed out how it applies to individuals. Another model is the apocalyptic eschatological model. And we find this places like in Amos 9, Ephesians 2, Galatians 1:4, and Zechariah 9 through 14, and Revelation, especially Revelation 12, is this kind of apocalyptic, otherworldly battle between the forces of good and forces of evil. So that's some of the models of atonement. Hebrews seems to focus some on the ransom substitution model, but there's different ways to view the cross. And if you're watching this Holy Week or just after Holy Week, just after Easter, there are different ways to view what Jesus' cross did for us as human beings, as people, to make us right with God. It's not just the lamb that was slain, but it's also an apocalyptic battle in some ways. As I've studied Revelation on Wednesdays with my church, I remind them that in some ways the end is already done. The cross was the victory, won the battle, won the war. But the devil just is kind of out skirmishes, has some fringe, has a little bit of power, he thinks. He just doesn't know the victory's been won yet. So that's one way to approach it. But anyway, so Hebrews is a mystery wrapped in an enigma in several ways, a very well thought out, very logical, very difficult text.